Hey guys, I'm Matt from Walker Armory. Today I wanted to show you how to completely take apart the frame of the Smith and Wesson Sigma. Now I do have another video where I'll show you guys how to completely take apart the slide of this firearm, and I'll put a link in the description box of that video below. But for the frame of the Sigma, we'll need a few tools, and we'll start off with just a small punch to take some of the pins out. And we also might need a small hammer to help us out. And I think it's useful to also have a roll of tape to help capture some of those pins and give you somewhere to put the gun up when you're pushing those pins out. So let's go ahead and get started at taking the frame apart on the Smith and Wesson Sigma. Split cup that's going to hold the spring up. Woo! Don't let go of that. This is going to slide out. Alright, we're going to start by field stripping the gun. So we're going to remove the magazine, clear the gun, make sure there's nothing in the barrel, pull the trigger, and then I like to hold it just like this, put a little bit of pressure on it like that, and as I put pressure on it, we're going to give the slide takedown lever here, pull down both sides, and then just release the slide, and it'll slide right off the top. We got our slide, our barrel, and our recoil spring right there, and we'll set those aside. So we're going to start with just the slide now. And before I like to get going, I like to take a lot of pictures of things that I'm going to be taking apart, simply so that I know how they go back together. I can use them as a reference when I go back together. So I always recommend taking a good look and kind of figuring out how the gun functions, how everything works, where everything fits. So you've got our front trigger pin here, which holds in our locking block, our trigger, and our slide release. All that's running through there. Our trigger return spring here is pulling everything back forward, runs all the way through our trigger bar, all the way to the back, which is actuating our sear. And then our ejector is here, and this whole housing back here is being held in by this pin here. So there's really only two pins we need to worry about taking out. Our slide takedown lever is located right here, and you can see both sides of that sticking out left and right. And that's just sitting on this little spring right here. So we'll go ahead and start by removing the rear sear housing. And this is where that piece of tape comes in handy, because I like to use it. It'll help us hold everything down and give the pin somewhere to go. So we'll just go ahead and start driving this pin out here. These pins aren't held in there super tight. It doesn't take a whole lot of force. A lot of time you can just press them out. But as this pin comes out, that's going to release our rear sear housing. This whole assembly back here, I just like to put my finger in front of it all and just lift it straight up like that. And then as you're doing that, you can pull the trigger, and that brings that trigger bar up, and then you just kind of work it out of there. And there is our rear sear housing. So we'll go ahead and start with this. This is a little bit more complicated. There's a couple of pins in here you can see. There's one here, there's one here, and there's another pin down here in the bottom. So to kind of figure out how all this is working, this trigger bar is actuating on this lever here and pushing this back and down, and that's what's actuating our sear. These two pins are being held in basically by the side of this frame, and then our ejector is just kind of sitting here in that channel. So we can go ahead by start by removing that. Again, take lots of pictures to kind of figure out how everything is oriented, and that way it'll help you figure out how it all goes back together. So we're going to start by driving out this bottom pin here, and we'll see if we can just push it out. There it goes. And we're just going to slide all this straight down through. So there goes that bottom pin, and now you can see this little pigtail spring in here. That's kind of a pain. All it's really doing is just adding weight to the trigger pull. But as we pull our punch out now, that spring is just going to fall out or shoot out. And then we'll release this. We'll put our spring in there so we don't lose it. And now our sear can drop, and we are actually going to pull it straight out of the top, because this pin here won't let us pull it out of the bottom. But you got to be careful, because I remember these pins are just being held in by the back side of this housing. So as this comes out, you got to be careful to not let those pins drop out, because there's not a whole lot holding those in. So there's our housing. We don't need that. And then these pins, like I said, a lot of times if you just put a little bit of pressure on that sear, those pins will kind of drop out and work free. And if they don't, we'll just put a little punch on there, Get that out of there. And then there's our sear and kind of our sear housing, I guess you could call. And there's two springs on here. There's an outer spring, which has given us trigger poundage and our strength. And then it's also got this inner core spring as well, that's reinforcing and helping keep everything straight. So that's how all of that goes together. And you can see these two pins down in there. There's one. And there's the other, and you can see they have those shelves on there, so they only fit in there one direction. When they're going back into here, one side is bigger than the other, so these are only a single direction that they fit. So just be careful of that when you're putting it back together. You can't really do it the wrong way, but know how they're oriented. Again, take lots of pictures, and we'll come back to all this. I'll throw all this down in here so we don't lose it, and keep on going with the rest of our slide, or our frame here. So now we're going to go ahead and take this pin out up front, and again just kind of figure out how everything's going. You've got your slide release, you've got your trigger down in here, here's your trigger bar, your trigger return spring, and your locking block are all being held on in here. There is a channel on this pin that this slide release is being held onto, and it's really hard to get it in and out of there. You kind of have to put pressure up and forward on this to get that pin to release. So I'm going to try and get that out of there. And I'm kind of putting a little bit of pressure on it there, and I'm going to hold it against that tape, and then I'm going to knock it loose. Like that. And then I've now pushed that pin out, so there's that channel that it was sitting into, and so because it's right there, we're going to push away from everything else. So we're going to drive it from the right to the left side, so it came out this side, and then we can now remove our punch. And as we do that, we can now pull out all of this stuff here. Here's our slide release, and then pull it a little farther out the rest of the way, and then we can pull out our locking block. Just lift up on that, that pops out. And our trigger just has to come free of the slide. And there it all is there. There's our trigger return spring. This just comes off right there. When you are putting it back together, again, make sure you see the way everything's oriented. This trigger return spring, when it slides back into that trigger, the top of this spring faces up. This open piece faces up when it goes back in there like that. When we take it off, you can take it off like that. So just make sure everything's put back together the same way it comes apart. Now, the only thing we really have left in here is the magazine catch down here and our slide stop lever. So we'll take this out. There's this spring here. Remember, that's pulling this down, and that's how we're taking the field strip in the gun. So we'll take and just put a little bit of pressure on the top of this spring, push this down, and then kind of out the side. And then you can see right there, and it's starting to come out the side. I'll just come over on this side with the punch and push it a little bit farther. And then this will slide right out the gun. Now there is a little bit of a lip here on this side. So again, when you're putting everything together, make sure you've got it oriented correctly when you put it back together. This little shelf, this lip, is facing back towards the trigger group of the gun. Everything's coming back this way. This is going to hold onto the barrel. So, and then this little spring in here, just kind of hook up underneath it and pull it out of the frame, and that just slides out right like that. So that's all there really is to it. For the magazine release, there's a straight spring basically down in there, and all you have to do to get that out is to slide that spring over to the side and out and back, and basically this whole thing will come out. There's no real reason to take that apart though, unless that breaks, but that's a pretty simple fix. It's a lot easier to put together than it is to take out, so we're not going to mess with it. There's no reason to get down in there and clean anything. We don't have any dirt or grime or anything down in there. So for all intents and purposes, this is a fully stripped frame on the Sigma. Now we'll go ahead and put it all back together, and we'll start basically the opposite direction that we came out with. So we'll start with our takedown spring, and I'll just drop that down into the frame right like that. And you just kind of push it in there. There's a little slot it fits down into right there. I like to take the back of the punch and kind of push that in there and make sure that's set in there correctly. We'll get our takedown lever and make sure that groove again is facing towards the rear. And we'll slide that in the side. And then as we're doing that, I'm going to press and put some pressure right there and allow that to just come right in the spot. And so now you can see on the back of it where that spring is kind of holding into that little channel, and our takedown lever's in there. So now we can go ahead and start putting our trigger components back in. We'll start by putting our trigger in there first. And again, remember the direction of this spring. When you put this in there, the top of the spring is facing up, this piece right here. So this is going to slide into this channel, right like that. And we'll drop this down into the frame. We'll put our locking block over the top of it. Now this is a little bit harder sometimes to get everything to line back up, but use your punch. We drove the pin out this way, so we're going to put it back in this way. So I'm going to use my punch coming from this side and kind of get everything to line up. And basically, I'm just trying to get my trigger and my spring and the locking block all lined up to go right like through there, so you can see right down through the top in there. I've got that trigger return spring and the trigger and everything running right through the punch, and it's a little bit of a smaller punch, so it's got some play down in there, but that's how everything's going to fit together. And then I'm going to take my slide stop lever and I'm going to push this in right off to the side. So I need to pull my punch out just enough to allow me to fit that slide stop lever in there. Let's see if I can get all that to line up. So now that's in there, and our trigger's in there. All that still works. Looks like we're in business. So now I'm going to take my pin here. Remember, we've got our little catch here on this side that's going in that slide stop lever. So I need to push it through this side, and I'm basically going to wiggle that punch around and line everything up, and slowly, if you can get it to work, it's great, but it's not always. Looks like I lost, there it is, I lost the spring in there, so I'm just going to grab it with my punch again, and then you can see it sliding all the way through right there. And then you hear it click into place. That's that catch grabbing onto our slide stop lever. So if we're holding this down, we pull the trigger, this is coming back, this is coming up. So it looks like everything's down in there, and this slide stop here is working good, and that pin is locked into place. So that's all we got. That's all back together. So now we're going to come back up into here, into the real fun part, and putting this back together. So again, lots of pictures kind of help figure out the orientation of everything, and it helps to kind of lay everything out and get the big picture. But basically, we need to put our sear back into our slide here, our slide housing, or not really sure what you call it, but it kind of slides up and down, so that's what I'm going to call it. Now this is a little trickier sometimes. I'm trying to get both of those pins into here, again the big side and the small side. So figure out how this gets oriented in here, and it's going to sit in here just like this, and then the sear is going to sit in like this, but I need to drop the pins in from this side, so I'm going to flip it 180. Now the easiest way that I've found is to bring my sear around the bottom and push both of these springs. We've still got our two springs on there. Push both of those forward, just like that. And I say it's the easier way. There is no real easy way that I found to do this. And I'm going to take my little stepped pin right there, and I'm going to set it in the bottom, right like that. So now it fits in there, and you see that shelf fits in there, it stops everything. And so now we've got our springs being pushed forward like that. Basically there's a little shelf you can see on the bottom of that sear that I need to get those springs to sit down in. So now I'm going to push those springs in as I rotate this forward, and then you can hear those springs just snapped into there. And so now it's sitting. Now very gently drop this pin forward. And if you do this wrong, it will explode in your hands and you're never going to find anything again. But there it goes. So there's that pin in there, right there. So now all this is back together, and you can see how that's pushing against it. Oop. And again, there's not much holding these pins in except for the side of that housing. So without that, it's a little tricky sometimes. So we'll just put it right there on the side. So now we need to assemble all this. So I'm going to hold these pins in as I slide this in to our housing. There it goes. Alright, so now the side of that housing are holding our pins in. Don't need to worry about it. And we can put this bottom piece in. Now this part is a little bit tricky because this little pigtail spring is kind of a pain. I don't necessarily recommend putting it back in because, again, all it does, it's a lawyer spring, all it does is add weight to the trigger. But for the sake of it, I'm going to show you how to reinstall it, or how I do it anyways. And I'm going to again use my punch to kind of, I went too far out and my pin fell back out, so let me drop this back in and push that back into the house. Basically, there we go. I'm going to hold it right there. So now I've got my punch holding everything together. And now I need to put this spring in here. Now it's going to sit in here just like this, basically. And all it's doing is just putting pressure here to here. So I'm going to see if I can pull my pinch out. And basically I need to put that spring in there and then grab it with the punch. Alright, like that. And then kind of work the punch down and around back through that hole. So now that's together, and I'm going to work this backwards now. I'll pull this punch back just a little bit and start this pin. Now I find that it's a little easier to kind of push this down like this, and I'm just going to push down on this housing, push the pin in as I'm pulling the punch out basically. And again, using that punch to kind of wiggle and line everything up. The spring kind of gets in the way in there a lot. We'll see what's holding it up there. So yeah, I'm still sitting in that spring, so let's see if we can get it to line up. Doesn't really look like it wants to. Like I said, this part is often easier said than done. Let's see if we can. This gets a lot easier if you're not fighting that spring down in the bottom. There it goes. Alright, so now we've got this piece set back together, and you can see how this is functioning, just like that. We're going to put our ejector back down in the channel. Basically those two moons, half moons, line up to make a full hole, and it just presses down in that channel. Now to get this back into the frame, pull the trigger to get our trigger bar all the way up. And remember, this trigger bar is what's catching this pin here, and then we're just going to slide it down right back into the frame. Push this pin through like that, and then looks like everything's functioning correctly. We've got our trigger return spring up here pulling everything forward, connected through our trigger bar back to our sear, which is operating just like that. And as we push down, that's going to release that. Catch it again. And our slide lock over here on the side works. So now all we have to do, slide everything back together, do a quick function check. Looks like it's working to me. So that's how you disassemble and reassemble completely the Smith and Wesson Sigma frame. It's a lot of work for a little bit of gun, but there's a lot of different mods you can do with it. We're going to work on getting a trigger job done on this next, so you'll definitely need to know how to do that. And again, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.